Meditation 1. Preparing for the Passover Holy Thursday, 13th of Nisan, the evening before. Jesus shared a final public meal with his friends at the home of Simon the leper in Bethany. During the meal, Mary Magdalene anointed his feet with costly perfume, a heartfelt gesture of devotion. However, Judas Iscariot was outraged by this act, considering it wasteful. Driven by his greed and bitterness, he left immediately for Jerusalem to conspire with the high priests to betray Jesus. After the meal, Jesus returned to the home of Lazarus, while some of the apostles stayed at an inn nearby. During the night, Nicodemus visited Jesus at Lazarus' home for a private conversation. Before dawn, Nicodemus departed for Jerusalem, accompanied partway by Lazarus. The disciples, curious about the upcoming Passover meal, asked Jesus where it would take place. Early that morning, Jesus called Peter, James, and John aside and gave them detailed instructions. He told them they would meet a man carrying a pitcher of water as they climbed Mount Zion. This man, already known to them from the previous year's Passover in Bethany, had helped prepare the meal for Jesus then. Jesus instructed them to follow the man to his home and say, "The Master says, 'My time is near. I will celebrate the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" The man named Heli would then show them the prepared room. Following Jesus' instructions, Peter and John set out for Jerusalem. They crossed a ravine south of the temple and ascended Mount Zion, turning south at the summit. As foretold, they encountered Heli, who joyfully welcomed their message. Unknown to him, Nicodemus had already arranged for the room to be ready for Jesus and his disciples. Heli, a relative of Zacharias of Hebron and a regular host for pilgrims, was honored to host the teacher and his followers. Meditation 2. The Upper Room. On the southern slope of Mount Zion, near the remains of David's old castle and the market at the base of the hill, stood a time-worn yet sturdy building. Surrounded by tall trees, it was enclosed within a spacious courtyard protected by strong walls. To the right and left of the entrance were additional structures. On the right, a residence for the steward, and close by, a house where Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other holy women would later gather after his death. The upper room, historically much larger, had once been a training space for David's loyal soldiers. It carried a rich history. Before the temple was built, the Ark of the Covenant had been stored there for an extended period, leaving traces of its presence in an underground chamber. The prophet Malachi had once taken refuge beneath this roof, where he wrote about the future sacrament of the Eucharist and the sacrifice of the new covenant. In its heyday, Solomon honored this house by using it for symbolic ceremonies, though the details are now lost. When the Babylonians destroyed much of Jerusalem, this house was spared. Later, it fell into disrepair until Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea acquired it, restoring the main structure and renting it to travelers for Passover celebrations. Jesus himself had used this space the previous year. The building also served as a workshop and storage for stone carvings. Joseph of Arimathea, who owned quarries, had large stone blocks transported here to be crafted into tombs, columns, and decorative items. Nicodemus shared in this trade, sculpting in his spare time. Their partnership had fostered a strong friendship. As Peter and John conversed with the man overseeing the upper room, Nicodemus could be seen clearing stones from the area to make the space accessible. A week earlier, preparations had begun for this year's Passover, with several disciples helping clean the courtyard and ready the room. Among them were relatives of Joseph of Arimathea, showing their quiet support for Jesus. Meditation 3. Preparing for the Last Supper. Jesus gave Peter and John precise instructions for the Passover preparations. Early in the day, he told them to go into the city and look for a man carrying a pitcher of water. This was a rare sight, as carrying water was usually the task of women or servants. As Jesus predicted, they met the man and followed him to a house with an upper room, which had been prepared beforehand for this important event. This upper room, steeped in historical significance, was where the Last Supper would take place. It had been used for sacred purposes in ancient times, including housing the Ark of the Covenant and serving as a place of refuge for prophets. Jesus sent Peter and John because of their closeness to him, entrusting them with this sacred task. They worked diligently, securing all that was necessary for the meal: lamb, bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and wine. These were not mere preparations for a meal, but symbolic elements central to the Jewish Passover celebration. Unknown to most present, this supper would mark the fulfillment of the Old Covenant and the establishment of the new one through Jesus himself. Meditation 4. The Paschal Supper. As the time for the Passover meal approached, Peter and John returned to the upper room, having completed all the necessary preparations as Jesus had instructed. The room was now ready, a place of solemnity and historical significance where ancient traditions met the profound reality of what was about to unfold. Jesus and his disciples gathered in this sacred space, their hearts filled with a mix of anticipation and unspoken tension. As evening fell, they reclined at the table, the familiar elements of the Passover meal before them, the lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. Yet, this meal was destined to be unlike any other. During the supper, Jesus spoke with deep emotion, revealing truths that stirred the hearts of his disciples. He foretold his betrayal, saying, "One of you will hand me over." A wave of sorrow swept through the room as each disciple, troubled, asked, "Is it I, Lord?" Jesus' words were both a warning and an invitation to examine their hearts. As the meal continued, Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then, taking a cup of wine, he gave thanks and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." In these moments, Jesus instituted the Holy Eucharist, offering his disciples and all of humanity a share in the profound mystery of his love and sacrifice. The simple elements of bread and wine became the means by which his presence would remain with them always. Amid the solemnity, Judas, who had already made arrangements to betray Jesus, silently left the room. The other disciples, unaware of his intentions, assumed he was handling some task for the group. His departure marked the beginning of the final stages of the Passion. This meal, rich in symbolism and divine action, was the culmination of centuries of preparation and prophecy. It was the bridge between the Old Covenant and the New, the moment when Jesus gave himself fully to his followers as the bread of life. Meditation.